Ranger Robert Bob Lakeman knew that smugglers were using old routes again. 5 years ago, these very same trails had led to his brother's death during a gunfight on the Canadian border. Now, frozen with paddle in hand, Bob watched for a clear sign of renewed illegal activity. Wolves were not supposed to be traveling in groups in this direction at this time of year. Bob pulled out his notebook and made a mark on the map. The third anomaly in a month in the same sector. It was as if the animals were avoiding a particular route that used to be part of their territory. He steered the canoe toward the western shore, where an almost imperceptible path was hidden among the boulders. Bob knew the area like the back of his hand, 5 years officially, and 5 more on the other side of the law. Kneeling down, he studied the barely visible mark, a specific tread pattern, not hunting, not hiking, just like it had been 5 years ago. Memory tossed up a sliver of the past, a November night in 1997, the sound of a motor on black water, his brother whispering, "One last time, Bobby," then flashes, screams, and deafening silence. James Lakeman's grave remained the hardest place to visit. James was 3 years older, always protecting his younger brother. Bob failed to protect him. Instead, he led him to his death, paving the way for smugglers. The Boundary Waters Preserve is 1,000,000 acres of wilderness, thousands of lakes, endless forests, the perfect place to cross the border for those who want to go undetected. Bob knew this better than anyone. That's why, after burying his brother and his past life, he became a ranger. At times, he thought James was watching him. In the sound of the wind among the pines, he promised his brother to redeem himself. Looking at the stranger's trail, Bob felt the flame inside that had brought him to this position. Someone was using the old trails again, and not for fishing. Nearby, he spotted a small metal object, a silencer plug, a specific model for a certain type of machine gun, not the kind you'd buy at a regular gun shop. Bob tucked the find into a plastic bag. He understood the pattern emerging from these fragments: gun smuggling, the game that had cost his brother his life. The sun had already risen above the crones when Lakeman returned to the canoe. A normal workday lay ahead, checking campsites, helping campers, watching for wildlife. But now Bob had another job, one he wouldn't report to his superiors, not now. 5 years ago, he couldn't stop the flow of guns across the border. This time, Robert Lakeman was ready. Bob Lakeman has been systematically recording anomalies since late June 2002. More and more marks appeared on the reserve map: unusual moose migrations, abnormalities in the behavior of wolf packs, and the sudden disappearance of beaver dams in the northern section of Gunsight Lake. To Bob, it was a pattern indicating the resumption of old smuggling routes. On the 27th of July, Ranger Station Chief Margaret Foster had instructed him to check out hikers' reports of strange sounds on Snake Lake. Bob nodded. The lake was 10 kilometers from the area he had already marked as potentially active. Official access to an area he was monitoring unofficially. The tent camp on the north shore of Snake was empty when Bob docked at sunset. Instead of setting up his own tent, he camouflaged his canoe and climbed the granite ledge overhanging the lake. A memory surfaced in my mind. October 1994. He's 22. James had already spent 2 years taking special cargo across the border for a Russian who everyone just called Mikhail. "Bobby, keep your mouth shut, eyes open, and you'll have $5,000 in your pocket," James. Not a lot of money for brothers who had lost their father and their mother on 2 jobs. Bob didn't ask questions about the sealed containers. For the first 6 months, he simply pointed the way across patrols. Then, Mikhail began to trust more. Machine guns, sniper rifles, heavy weapons parts, everything went south. Money and drugs went north. By 1996, the Lakeman brothers controlled 3 major routes through the reservation. The good life ended in November 1997, when the Border Patrol ambushed a crossing at Lake Oten. James covered the group's retreat, 3 bullets to the chest, died before the helicopter arrived. Bob went into the woods for a week. When he came back, he burned the route maps, smashed his phone, and disappeared from the smuggling ring. 3 months later, he filed a report with the Ranger Service. Back in the present, Bob noticed a barely discernible light on the opposite side of the lake. For a second, no longer. At 2 in the morning, the surface of the lake was breached by 3 canoes moving silently from east to west, a classic Y6 route on Bob's old system. The men in the boats were in black with minimal equipment, professionals. Bob took a few pictures. Not clear enough in the dark, but it was a start. He noted the time, direction, and approximate amount of cargo. The next day, Bob reported to Foster that he'd found nothing unusual. The official check was closed. The unofficial investigation was just beginning. By September 2002, Bob had gathered enough data to form a picture. Old routes resumed, but with changes. New technology, GPS instead of paper maps, thermal imagers to detect patrols, lightweight composite boats, and new faces. Not a single person from Michael's old network did he recognize. On the 14th of September, Bob met Alan Red Cloud, an elderly member of the Ojibwe people who was harvesting wild rice on the shores of Saginaga Lake. "The water has new voices," the old man said without saying hello. "She does not like to be walked upon by those who bring death." "I am no longer a shadow," replied Bob to the unspoken accusation. "But you follow in the footsteps of the shadows. They came back for a reason, not for the old, for the new, big money, big risks." "What do you know?" asked Bob directly. "Fraser Lake, a cabin on the north shore. Look at it, but don't come any closer. The shadows can see in the dark better than you can." Bob found the cabin 2 days later, an old hunting lodge not marked on tourist maps. It looked abandoned. He watched from a safe distance for 36 hours. On the 3rd night, he got closer. Inside the hut, we found a modern satellite communications system disguised as an old radio. Under the floorboards was a cache of watertight containers. They contained components for assembling rifles, night vision sights, and new-style silencers. He documented his find with a camera, then returned everything to its place, masking any trace of his presence. Back at the station, Bob began drafting a formal report. The evidence was irrefutable. On the 2nd of October 2002, National Parks Director Jonathan Pierce announced a reorganization. The Boundary Waters Reserve was being divided into 5 sectors with separate administrative centers. "Ranger Lakeman," Pierce addressed Bob personally after the general meeting, "your experience in the eastern sector is invaluable. You are being transferred to Grand Lake with a promotion to senior wildlife specialist." Grand Lake was 70 kilometers from the area of his investigation. The transfer was effective immediately. Back at his cabin, Bob found it had been searched, professionally but carelessly. The hiding place under the floorboards with his observation notes was untouched, but the removable memory card from his camera was gone. During the night, Bob hid his notes and the remaining evidence in a waterproof container that he buried in the woods near the station. His sudden transfer was no coincidence. At dawn, he canoed the Saginaga Lake for the last time. Somewhere here, the arms smuggling story ended for his brother. Somewhere here, the story would continue, but not now. Once in his new location, Bob realized that his investigation would have to be put on hold. But he knew he'd be back sooner or later. The smugglers wouldn't disappear, and now he was sure someone high up was protecting their operations. It was a game of time, and Robert Lakeman knew how to wait. Bob Lakeman spent 17 months away from his investigation. During that time, he developed into a valuable expert in a new sector, despite his reticence and reluctance to talk about the past. On the 12th of March 2004, a storm of unprecedented strength hit northern Minnesota, downing thousands of trees and altering lake shorelines. All rangers were mobilized for damage assessment and rescue operations. Lakeman announced the new coordinator, "You are requested to assist in the western sector. Your knowledge of Saginaga Lake is needed for the search party." As he flew above the reserve, Bob saw the extent of the devastation. Nature had redrawn the map, creating new channels and barriers. For most, it was a disaster. For Bob, an opportunity. After the rescue mission was completed, he was given a special assignment: to reconnoiter the most inaccessible areas, including those where he had once found evidence of smugglers. The hut at Fraser Lake was empty. Floorboards gone. The floor had been replaced. There was no trace of the smugglers' previous routes. Only on the fifth day, while exploring a small unnamed island in Gunflint Lake, current during a sudden storm, Bob noticed an anomaly. A fallen pine tree had formed a natural bridge to a previously inaccessible rocky ledge. Beneath the cliff, Bob discovered a camouflaged cave. Inside, traces of recent human presence, military rations, waterproof containers, and most importantly, the remains of burnt documents. Among the charred fragments, Bob found part of a map with markings. One of the locations he recognized was the ranger hut at Cactus Lake. Having completed the mission, Bob requested additional time to check the huts in the western sector. The request was approved. At the Cactus Lake hut, approaching from the west side, Bob spotted a camouflaged boat away from the official dock. Instead of approaching the cabin, he hid in the woods and began surveillance. After dark, 2 men arrived. Their conversation Bob heard clearly. "Mikhail's not happy about the delay. After the storm, the feds are everywhere. 2 weeks tops. When the Rangers leave, we'll resume shipments." Mikhail was the same name the Russian smuggler had used in the 90s. Bob documented everything on a dictaphone and a night mode camera. He learned that the storm had disrupted the smugglers' plans, but they quickly adapted, using the new paths created by the elements. Back at base, Bob contacted former partner Jason Wheeler, now working for the Border Patrol. In a quiet bar in the town of Ely, he outlined his findings. "I have evidence of guns being smuggled through the reserve, but I suspect someone in management is involved." Jason listened intently, looking at the photos and notes. "This is serious, Bob. If you're right about the corruption, we need to proceed with caution." They devised a plan. Jason would run names and routes through his channels. Bob would continue to gather evidence. Information would be exchanged through the stash house in Ely. By the autumn of 2004, Bob had secured a temporary transfer to the western sector under the pretext of training new rangers. Over the next few months, he identified a new route system for the smugglers. After the storm, they were not using the main waterways, but rather shallow channels and rugged sections. Jason confirmed Bob's suspicions. Law enforcement agencies received information about a supply channel for high-tech weapons from Eastern Europe through Canada to the United States. In January 2005, one of the new rangers, Mike Dawson, noticed unusual activity near an abandoned sawmill. Bob verified the information personally. The sawmill turned out to be a transshipment point. Weapons were being shipped through the reserve in small batches and then collected for further transport. Bob recorded the license plates of the vehicles, filmed the transshipment process, and identified the participants. The most shocking discovery was the presence among the smugglers of Arthur Coleman, Deputy Director of the Ranger Service. Bob now understood why his investigation had been interrupted 2 years ago. After collecting the evidence, Bob turned the material over to Jason for a federal agent he trusted. On the 15th of February 2005, Bob received a message from Mike Dawson. The young ranger had discovered something strange at Saginaga Lake and was asking for help. It was a trap. When Bob arrived, he found signs of a struggle and blood in the snow. A note on a tree contained 2 words, "Follow your brother." The tracks led into the woods. Bob realized the danger, but he couldn't abandon his apprentice. In an abandoned cabin, he found Mike tied to a chair. Behind him stood Sergei, Mikhail's right-hand man from the old smuggling network. "Hello, Bobby," Sergei pronounced. "Mikhail sends his regards." A blow to the back of the head plunged Bob into darkness. He woke up in a Duluth hospital with a head injury. Jason, not having received a conditional call, organized a search. Bob was found unconscious in the snow. Mike Dawson was missing. The investigation materials were seized by a special commission of the FBI. An operation against arms smuggling was officially announced. However, a month later, the investigation was closed due to insufficient evidence. Arthur Coleman retained his position, and Bob was warned not to return to the case. Jason was transferred to the southern border. All the strings were broken. By the summer of 2005, Bob had recovered physically, but Mike's disappearance weighed on him. When he returned to duty, he found that he had been reassigned again to the central sector of the reserve. Bob realized he was being watched. His phone was tapped, his emails checked. He decided to retreat temporarily, but not to give up. In his diary, Bob wrote, "They think they have bought time, but time is on my side. I will wait as long as it takes." Snow covered the reserve in a thick blanket and crackling frost covered the lakes. Bob Lakeman snowshoed across the surface of Basswood Lake, checking the motion sensors. In a year and a half, he had become a model Central Sector Ranger, methodical, executive, initiative-free. Outwardly, he had accepted defeat. He did not bring up the subject of smuggling, was not interested in the Western Sector. At meetings, he reported dry figures and led the life of a recluse. But inside, he kept waiting. Bob knew that criminals always make mistakes. On the 20th of January 2007, Bob received a strange letter with no return address. Inside was nothing but a dried wild rice leaf and a small, oddly shaped stone. To most people, rubbish. To Bob, a message from Alan Red Cloud. This was the shape of the stone at the tribe's sacred site at Granite Lake. At the sacred stone, Bob met not Alan, but his grandson, David Red Cloud, a young man with a university education and a deep knowledge of tradition. "Grandfather died last autumn," David informed him, "but made me promise to find you when the time came." It turned out Alan had been following shadows on the water all these years. Even seriously ill, he'd noticed new activity in the northern bays. "Grandfather said there's a big crossing coming during the next full moon. They're getting ready to carry more weapons than ever." David handed Bob a hand-drawn map. "And he also saw their leader, the one responsible for the deaths of many people, including your brother. The opportunity to finally find those responsible for his brother's death and Mike Dawson's disappearance changed everything." Bob realized that this time he had no margin for error. He turned to the last person he could trust, old gamekeeper Tom Harris, who had retired before Bob became a ranger. Tom lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of Ely, raised dogs, and avoided contact with former colleagues. But he made an exception for Bob. "You've got yourself into a dangerous business, lad," the old man grumbled, "but I'm going to help for James' sake." Seeing the surprise on Bob's face, Tom added, "I knew you both as boys. Often took you and your brother fishing when your father couldn't. James deserves justice." Through his connections, Tom obtained information about the Rangers' movements in the Western Sector and provided Bob with equipment for an autonomous expedition. On the 7th of February 2007, 3 days before the full moon, Bob took a leave of absence to supposedly visit his sick mother. Instead, he traveled to the Western Sector on a route that avoided checkpoints. Bob moved only at night, using his knowledge of the territory and camouflage skills. After 2 days, he reached the North Shore Ridge, a rocky ridge along the Canadian border. Following Alan's map, Bob found an abandoned hunting lodge camouflaged among the rocks. He noticed signs of security surveillance positions, infrared sensors, patrols with dogs. For 2 days, Bob studied the guard shift schedules. On the third day, taking advantage of a snowstorm, he penetrated the perimeter. In the cabin, he found 4 armed guards and a command post with detailed maps of the reserve, including markings of the burial sites of those who interfered with their operations. On one of the photos, Bob saw Mike Dawson's last shot marked "Eliminated." Holding back his anger, he stealthily backed away without revealing his presence. A major discovery awaited him at a rocky ledge a kilometer from the lodge. There, in an equipped cave, was the operations command center. Using a directional microphone, Bob learned the details of the upcoming plan. The largest arms shipment was being prepared: assault rifles, sniper rifles, and even rocket launchers. But the main cargo was the latest military-grade night vision scopes and computerized guidance systems, technology that was banned for export. Among those present in the command center, he recognized a gray-haired man with a military bearing, Jonathan Pierce, director of the National Parks Department, the same man who had transferred him from the Western Sector 5 years ago. The plan had called for a diversionary maneuver, a simulated terrorist attack on the eastern border of the reserve, which would divert all law enforcement forces from the real route. Bob realized that he could not act alone, but it was also dangerous to go the official way. Once outside the surveillance area, he contacted Tom. I need direct contact with the FBI or the Justice Department, Bob explained. Someone outside the National Park System. There is one person. My niece works in the Special Prosecutor's Office. The day before the full moon, Bob met with Agent Sarah Harris. He handed over all the materials he had gathered and described the upcoming operation. We can organize the raid in 12 hours, Sarah reported, but we need someone on the inside to confirm the presence of the main figures. Bob agreed to come back and help despite the risk. In the evening, a plan of action was developed. On the morning of the 10th of February 2007, Bob returned to his position at the command center. Soon all the key participants arrived, including Pierce and Coleman. Bob relayed the confirmation signal to the federal agents. The raid began at noon. The command center and the command post lodge were attacked simultaneously. Bob, armed only with a hunting knife, infiltrated the lodge during the commotion and collected the remaining evidence, including a snapshot of Mike. Making his way out through the woods with the evidence, Bob encountered Sergei, the same man who had lured him and Mike into a trap 2 years earlier. The Russian had a gun pointed directly at Bob. "Drop your weapon, Sergei." Mikhail, the same smuggler who had once hired the Lakeman brothers, appeared from behind the trees. "We've lost." Mikhail turned to Bob. "Your brother saved my life once. I remember things like that. Go away." Bob hesitated. Before him stood the man indirectly responsible for James's death. "This isn't for you," Bob pronounced. "It's for James's sake. He'd want me to do the right thing." Bob left Mikhail and Sergei to the federal agents and led Mike out to the safe zone. Over the next weeks, the entire smuggling network was uncovered. More than 30 people were arrested. Jonathan Pierce and Arthur Coleman received lengthy prison sentences. Bob testified under the protection of the Witness Protection Program. Mikhail made a deal with the investigation, providing information about the network's international connections. He never mentioned meeting Bob in the woods. In the spring of 2007, Bob Lakeman stood on the shore of Saginaga Lake, looking out over the water where he had once led smugglers with his brother. Now that chapter of his life was closed. Justice had been served. He pulled an old, worn photograph out of his pocket. Him and James fishing, the year before the tragedy. "I did it, brother," Bob said quietly. "We're both free now." Bob Lakeman steered his canoe to a small island in the center of Saginaga Lake, a place where he once fished with his brother. After an operation that ended with the arrest of 30 people, including Jonathan Pierce and Arthur Coleman, Bob's life changed. The FBI was offering an anti-smuggling unit. The Border Patrol called for a counselor. Bob chose a different path. He remained a ranger, heading a training center for young professionals at Basswood Lake. Today, Bob was on a special trip. In his rucksack was a capsule containing a photograph of James, a letter from his mother, and a fragment of a map of old trails. He decided to bury these memories on the island, symbolically closing the door to the past. Climbing up the rock he saw the old initials, his and his brother's, scratched out years ago. Bob placed the capsule under the boulder. "Case closed, brother," he pronounced. As he returned, he noticed an elderly Indian, a relative of Alan Red Cloud, on the shore. "The water is calm again," said the old man, "but she remembers everything." That evening, Bob wrote in his diary, the 10th of June, 2008. 10 years ago, I came here to atone for my brother's death. Today, that journey is complete. Out of our mistakes, something right can be born, if we find the strength to correct them. The reserve took me in, broke me down, and put me back together again. It is now my home. Tomorrow, a new group of interns were arriving. He had an important story to share, about finding his way back when all seems lost. He knew he would never forget James or Mike, but now that memory gave not pain but strength to carry on their work. Friends, you've just heard the story of the Boundary Waters Reserve Ranger, a man who chose the path of redemption. But what if the smuggling ring wasn't completely uncovered? Mike Dawson's body was never found. Perhaps he learned something that made him disappear? And most importantly, what other secrets lurk in the depths of America's national parks? Share your theories in the comments. If the story hooked you like me, support the channel by liking and subscribing. More exciting stories from the wildest and most mysterious corners of the national parks are waiting for you in the next issues. See you in America's wilderness, where every turn of the trail hides a story that takes your breath away.